Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Sustainability Star training on sustainability communications. So this training is going to focus on the communication aspect of working with people specifically. And communication is a really important tool when it comes to sustainability because a lot of what we do is focused on trying to convince users to change their behavior. And being able to communicate and influence across silos, especially without authority or even sometimes with it, is really critical in creating user behavior change. So often we're tasked with communicating with students, with colleagues, with peers, trying to convince them to change their behaviors. So the ability to convince them without necessarily having authority, to say, oh, no, you must do this, or even when you do have that authority, is really critical in making sure you're successful when advocating for sustainability and sustainability change. So when we talk about messaging, so traditionally when you think about the environmental movement or sustainability, you might have seen some of the graphics to the left where it's just kind of these very generic messages about save the environment, save the polar bears. Research has now shown that information campaigns like this by themselves without any context are not necessarily effective in changing behavior, which is what we ultimately want people to do. So when you're talking about trying to educate people, you really need to think about when it comes to sustainability, how does providing this information actually address the barriers for that target population to adopt that desired behavior? So if you're telling them to do something like recycle more or carpool, what is your messaging doing to help address the barriers that might be stopping them from doing that already? And this is different than traditional advertising because if you think about, people trying to sell a car, sell you a product, switching products is fairly easy to do because it's something that you were going to do already anyway. So if you're going to go buy, a plate or something like that, it's very easy to convince them to switch over to a bamboo plate versus a paper plate because they were in the market for that anyway. And that doesn't necessarily require changing their behavior. So if you're trying to do something that will cause them to act differently, using those same approaches aren't always as effective. So it requires a different way of thinking about messaging when it comes to user behavior change. And this is where community-based social marketing comes in. So that's the focus of this training because it's a different approach to the way traditional marketing works or traditional environmental messaging works. And the way that this technique plays out is that basically it's a four-step process. So the first step is to actually select the behavior that you want promoted. So what is it that I actually want people to do when they hear this message? Next is to identify the barriers and benefits associated with that selected behavior, actually understanding, what do the people gain from doing this behavior, or what's really stopping them from doing this behavior already. And then step three is designing a strategy that utilizes very unique tools to help address those barriers that came up in step two. And then, of course, step four is actually piloting a strategy, evaluating whether you're successful and implementing that broadly. So that's kind of the four-step process of community-based social marketing, which will actually help you in terms of advocating to your colleagues and your students and your peers when it comes to making sustainable behavior change. So as part of stage one is, of course, you need to identify the target behavior. So with this messaging, what am I actually trying to get people to do? So how do you decide what behaviors you focus on? A lot of that is dependent on what your goals are. So trying to think of low-hanging fruit, like what's the really easy behavior that we want everyone to adopt? What's going to have the best return on investment if everyone does this behavior? And also thinking about who your target population is, because if you're looking at, people in an office versus students versus your colleagues, they might all have very different behaviors that you're trying to target and get them to change. So when you're trying to think about what behaviors you want them to modify, it's really important that you're selecting non-divisible behaviors. So not that they're actually just doing the behavior, but that behavior is going to have a real impact and be effective on its own. So a good example in community-based social marketing is, if you wanted people to install a energy efficient thermostat, the behavior isn't necessarily them going out and buying the thermostat. You have to say you actually want them to install it. So focusing on that installation behavior as opposed to just going out and shopping, so you don't end up with a bunch of thermostats that never get installed, will be more beneficial to what you're trying to get them to change in terms of behavior. And also looking at the end end state. So, this is the end state, like, okay, once they've installed thermostat, that's what I want, as opposed to trying to focus on behaviors that might or might not actually lead to the result that you need. So it's very important to spend a lot of time thinking about what you actually want that target behavior in your audience to be. So for step 2, the next step is, okay, well, I've identified a behavior I want people to do, but now you need to identify what the barriers and benefits are. So what's really stopping people from wanting to do this right now? And there could be a variety of things. It could be the lack of infrastructure convenience, or, there are no services for me to do this behavior. And sometimes it is lack of information, like they just didn't know how, or they didn't know it was important. So there's a lot of different things that can go into that. And the way you find out what those barriers are is really just by asking. So, that could be in the form of surveys, it could be in the form of interviews, it could just be even general observations that you're making as a user yourself. So there's a lot of ways you can kind of find that information. And also you have to think about the benefits too. So like, what's in it for them in terms of to yourself, to others, to the community, if you actually do this behavior. And it doesn't necessarily have to be an environmental reason all the time, right? So it might be good for the environment, but there might be other benefits that make this much more appealing to the average user. Maybe there's an element of campus pride if they do that. Maybe there's some benefits to the students or the community if they participate in this behavior. Or maybe it's even more convenient and they just didn't know, right? So being able to sell that in terms of identifying those benefits is just as important as identifying the barriers that's stopping them from adopting that behavior more widely. And in step 3 is developing strategies, which is actually the more interesting part of this. So you need to develop strategies that are going to reduce the barriers and increase the benefits to make this behavior really appealing to people. And ultimately, what you're trying to do is make that desired action much more appealing than the opposite behavior. So, carrots and sticks, right? So are you discouraging the alternative and making the behavior you want more appealing? So ways of actually making that happen. And then, of course, you can pilot small scale and get some data to see if it's effective before you launch more broadly. And steps 4 and 5, again, it's once you've kind of had those little successes and seen what works, you can kind of pilot, evaluate, and implement on a much broader scale. And then, based on that data you collected in the previous steps and to see if the small changes had an effect. And then you can then apply those best practices to larger rollouts. So that's the general approach. So to see this in the real world, a good example on our campus is recycling. So if you've been around for the last couple of years, you've seen there's been a lot of changes on the recycling front. So let's focus on a behavior and say that our goal is ultimately we want campus users to put their recyclable materials into the recycling streams / dumpsters instead of putting everything in the trash. So if we're doing a community-based social marketing approach to this, the first step is obviously to identify the benefits and barriers. So what's really stopping people from, putting their stuff in the recycle bin versus the trash bin. So the way that we did this is conducting waste audits. We interviewed campus users, students, staff, and faculty. We've administered multiple surveys over the years. We've conducted outreach events to try to get feedback from people and identify attitudes towards recycling and existing knowledge levels to basically come up with a list of barriers and benefits. So the desired behavior being they actually put their recyclable materials into campus recycling bins. What we were finding in terms of a couple really common barriers was that trash bins were much more common and prevalent than recycling and empty more fruit regularly. So it made it more convenient to put everything in the trash as opposed to the recycling. Also, we identified the lack of knowledge as a major barrier in terms of there was no signage, as you can see from the photos. It's like there's no signage, there's no training. It's not really telling users what's recyclable. So they had a huge knowledge barrier in that regard as well. So in terms of identifying potential strategy, was changing the infrastructure. So centralizing waste stations, providing recycling bins next to every trash bin and providing the same level of service to make it equally or more so convenient to recycle versus putting stuff in the trash. Also, again, addressing that lack of knowledge in terms of providing signage on every bin, trying to provide campus-wide training and educational outreach to provide sorting guidance were all big factors in reducing that barrier to people wanting to put their recyclables into the campus recycling bins. And in terms of the benefits, in terms of selling this, again, by making it just as convenient to throw things in the recycling versus the trash, it's better for the environment. We can have pride as a zero waste campus. The signage built in makes it easier for visitors to know what's recyclable. And there's also non-environmental benefits too, right? So emphasizing the fact that it actually looks nicer than the old models that we had before. So it's actually increasing your campus aesthetics. Little cool functional things like the fact that it actually deters angry squirrels. So So now we have lids that actually prevent squirrels from climbing in there and attacking people when they come out. From a maintenance perspective, not having lids flying off and ending up in parking lots, increasing the convenience of staff to service these bins, and also making it easier to make future changes as well. If we need to change up the signage or the look at all, it's actually quite an easy retrofit. So there's a lot of other side benefits that we were able to sell to make this a campus-wide retrofit, and sell that to upper administration as well as the campus as a whole. And in terms of strategy techniques, so that's just a small example of things that we do in sustainability every day, but you as advocates, you're going to have to do a lot of communication with students, with your peers and colleagues, and there's different strategies you can use to do that. So one of the things that community-based social marketing has found is that commitments have a really big impact on the way that people react or will behave. So even making a small commitment will make you more likely to commit to a bigger one. So if you get people to say, hey, I'm willing to recycle more, they actually are more likely to take a bigger commitment to zero waste or actually do more activities because they feel like, okay, well, I made the one commitment, so I'll make a bigger one. And we found that even non-binding pledges work. So even if there's no level of enforcement or anything, if you say yes, I will recycle more, people in general like to think that they're trustworthy. So if they sign a pledge, generally they will follow up on that commitment. And even within that, there's a whole another gradient in terms of the way that those pledges are delivered. So written pledges that they have to sign are always much more effective than just verbal pledges. If you have those pledges be public, they're much more likely to commit than if it was just a private pledge that no one will see. And also if they make that pledge in front of a group, it's much more likely to stick than if they were just making that individually, privately by themselves. Also, another thing that works for commitments is having block leaders. So people who actually act as leaders, that they are, they're peers with these people, and demonstrate that example. They're much more likely to have an influence in their community. And that has the individual participate in that process of actually wanting to be involved. Also, there's self-perception theory. So that basically says that if someone makes a commitment or takes action in a certain area, that actually influences the way people think of themselves. So they think of themselves as someone who actually cares about that issue and is more likely to support those initiatives in future. So those are all ways that we can influence people to make those behavior changes. Also, additional strategies is that peer pressure. So we're very social creatures and no one wants to be left out. So social norms are really huge in terms of influencing sustainability. So if you see that everyone else is bringing a reusable water bottle, you're more likely to bring one too. So modeled visible behavior spreads very rapidly through social networks. So if people are seeing this behavior exhibited in their workplace or in their classrooms, that model or that behavior tends to diffuse across the whole social network. Additionally, things that work are competition. So, feeling like, oh, we're saving more energy than the building next to us, or I'm doing better than my peers, is actually a great incentive for people to want to engage in sustainable behavior. And also the feeling of being watched, as in terms of actually having people watch you put things into the recycle bin, is actually very effective. So even they found simple things like putting eyes on a poster, even though that's not a real person watching you, it actually influences people to model better behavior. So there is kind of interesting psychology around that. Also, other important things to think about is prompts. So making sure that they're being reminded of this behavior at the point of the behavior. So for example, signage at the recycling bin when they're about to throw things away, as opposed to kind of putting up a sign really far away and expecting them to remember, helps prevent forgetting. So trying to make sure that your prompts are actually right where the action is going to happen. Also persuasion, so making sure that you're having captivating information when you're talking about why people should adopt this behavior, and also knowing your audience and what's going to appeal to them, as well as framing in terms of making sure that that behavior is emphasized is really important in your messaging. And also there's the added tools you can use for making sure it's really convenient and making sure there are incentives associated with it. So those are all techniques you can use to try to influence behavior amongst your peers. However, one caveat, especially for those of us who are in education in terms of trying to communicate with large groups of people, there's a limited effectiveness when it comes to threat-based messaging. So, the whole thing about like, oh, climate change is terrible and the world is burning up and, like the polar bears are drowning, all of that stuff, there's kind of a limited effectiveness in that in the way you frame it. And what community-based social marketing has found is that when someone, there's two ways that people can cope with information. Either they can use problem-focused coping, where they actually say, I'm going to do something about this problem, or emotion-focused coping, where they just kind of emotionally are dealing with it, and then they just feel like it's dependent on how much control they feel like they have to correct the problem. So if we perceive we have a significant amount of control, as in, I can do something about this, we're much more likely to apply our energies to focusing on solving the problem. However, the opposite, if we perceive we have very little, let's say global climate change, and we feel like there's nothing we can do about it, we're much more likely to react with emotions and just not really follow up with actual problem-based action. So also, in terms of the control that we have, is largely determined by our sense of community. So if we feel like we in concert with others can actually have an impact, and we actually have some influence, we're more likely to act. If, however, we feel like, we don't really have common purpose with the community that's going to make a difference, we're more likely to perceive there's little we can do personally, so why care, right? So when it comes to threat-based messaging, it's very important to think about making it action-based and being, focused on what the solutions are and not just, emotionally downpouring on people saying, how terrible this all is, but actually having some actionable solutions that they can use in concert with their community. So that's important to keep in mind. And finally, in terms of other tips, so outside of community-based social marketing, when it comes to sustainability communication, there's some just basic marketing 101 things to keep in mind as well. So you always want to have a value proposition when you're talking about, hey, I want you to adopt this behavior, or this is something that we need to do for sustainability. And really think about what's in it for me. So that's basic marketing 101, is that, you need to make sure that there's incentive for that person to help. Or do the behavior you want, and making sure that that's very clear in your messaging. So it's not just information dumping. There's actually something they can do with that information at the end of it. And similarly, making sure there's a built-in call to action. So now that you've told them all this, what do you actually want them to do with that information? So making sure that every time you're messaging to them, they feel empowered to actually act on what you've told them in terms of that information. And in terms of follow-up, it's always helpful to provide metrics and feedback so that people feel like they have an impact, saying like, hey, because of you, we've reduced, or increased our diversion rate by 50%. Something that's going to help them feel motivated and feel like that their actions have meaning. And always, be sure that you're communicating to customer profile data. So basically talking to people and actually understanding, hey, is this effective? Or, hey, what do you think about this? Is all really useful data when it comes to sustainability messaging as a whole. So definitely don't miss out on the opportunities to collect those surveys and that data, and even just have those conversations. And in terms of other resources, community-based social marketing, there's actually a free book if you sign up online at that website. So I highly encourage you to take a look at that and see how you can apply some of those techniques to your own communication with your colleagues and your peers and your students. And on top of that, don't forget, we also have an ASHE.org paid membership for everyone with an @csudh.edu email address. So on the ASHE.org website, because you're a CSUDH member, you can use your email to create a free login, access faculty resources, free webinars and trainings on this and other topics, or really anything sustainability related. They have case studies, they have project resources, there's actually active forums and newsletters. So highly encourage you to sign up for those resources as well and take advantage of that membership. So thank you for paying attention to this training. And at this point, we'll open it up for questions. And if you have any further questions, feel free to email us at sustainability@csudh.edu.